Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow Frederick Douglass into the darkness of a September night in 1838, a borrowed sailor's uniform, a forged document, and a train moving north through a country that considered him property. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever is holding you right now. The mattress beneath your back. The weight of a blanket across your chest. The soft give of a pillow beneath your head. Tonight, we are going somewhere far away, not in miles, exactly, but in time. We are going to the eastern shore of Maryland, in the early years of the 19th century, where the Chesapeake Bay breathes in long silver sighs against low, marshy ground, and the pine trees stand very still in the darkness before dawn. There is a young man in that darkness. He is carrying nothing but himself and a borrowed piece of paper. He is moving towards something he can barely name. And what he does next will change everything. Part 1: The Land and the Water, the World That Made Him. There is a particular quality to the light on the Chesapeake Bay in the early morning hours. It comes slowly, the way most lasting things do. First there is only darkness, a thick, low darkness that smells of salt water and marsh grass and the particular dampness of tidewater soil. And then, almost before you notice it beginning, there is a faint gray at the horizon, just barely distinguishable from the black of the water. And then the gray softens into something almost violet, and the trees along the shoreline begin to emerge from the night, cypress and sweet gum and loblolly pine, their reflections shimmering in the still inlets. This is the land where Frederick Douglass was born. The eastern shore of Maryland is a peninsula, which is to say, it is nearly an island. To the east, the Atlantic Ocean lies just beyond the flat horizon. To the west, the great expanse of the Chesapeake Bay separates it from the rest of Maryland and the growing cities to the north. And in between, cutting through the land in long lazy curves, are rivers and creeks and tidal flats that would have been familiar to the Algonquian people long before any European ship arrived, and familiar still to the watermen and farmers and enslaved people who worked this land in the centuries that followed. It was a land of extraordinary natural beauty and extraordinary human suffering, sometimes present in the same moment, in the same view, from the same pair of eyes. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, that was the name he was born with, and he would carry it through the early years of his life before choosing another, was born somewhere around 1818, on the eastern shore, in a place called Talbot County. We say somewhere around 1818 because no one recorded the exact date. Enslaved children were not given the gift of their own birthdays. Their births were not celebrated. Their ages were not preserved the way you might press a flower between the pages of a book. He was born to a woman named Harriet Bailey, who was herself enslaved on a farm some 12 miles from the place where her son would spend his earliest years. The distance between them was not accidental. In the system of enslavement that governed every aspect of this world, the separation of mothers and children was common, unremarkable, a thing that happened with the same quiet routine as the turning of seasons. Harriet Bailey would walk those 12 miles on foot, in the night, after her day's work was done, to see her son sleeping. And then she would walk back before the dawn, before her absence could be noted, before any consequence could fall on her. Frederick never knew what his mother looked like in the daylight. He saw her only a handful of times in his entire childhood, and always in darkness, always in the brief hours before she had to return. She died when he was around 7 years old, and he was not permitted to attend her burial. He would write about her later in words that are both restrained and devastating, as the stranger who came to him in the night, who held him with a warmth that had no daylight in it. His father, he would say, was almost certainly a white man, almost certainly his enslaver or a man connected to the enslaving household. But this, too, was something he could not know with certainty, because no one would tell him. In the culture of enslavement, the paternity of enslaved children was not a matter for discussion. It was one of the many truths that the system kept carefully sealed. Frederick spent his earliest years living with his maternal grandmother, Betsy Bailey. She was a woman of remarkable competence and quiet dignity, a fisherwoman who knew how to set crab pots in the tidal creeks, how to smoke and preserve the catch, how to navigate the rhythms of this marshy, watery world. She raised her grandson in a small cabin on the edge of a plantation called Home Hill Farm, owned by a man named Aaron Anthony. In those early years, under his grandmother's care, Frederick experienced something that might cautiously be called a kind of partial freedom, a freedom from the full knowledge of what he was, what his world would demand of him. He ran barefoot through the grass. He played near the creek. He watched the herons standing motionless in the shallows, and the ospreys making their long spiraling dives toward the silver flash of a fish. He was a child in a world of children, and the full weight of the system that owned him had not yet descended. He would later say that the moment it descended was one of the most brutal shocks of his life. Not a physical shock, not yet, but an understanding. A door opening onto a view he had not been prepared for. He sat down in the dirt and wept. That cry of a small child in the yard of a plantation, the loss of the one person who had made the world feel safe, is one of the most human moments in a story that is already almost unbearably human. Because what happens to a child when the ground beneath him disappears? What happens to the child who discovers, without being told in words, that he is property? He goes on. He learns the shape of the new world. He watches and listens and begins to understand. The White House plantation was an enormous operation, hundreds of enslaved people, vast fields of corn and tobacco, a mill, a blacksmith's shop, storehouses, and the great house itself, which looked out over the Wye River with an air of permanence, of settled authority, that the people who built it would never be allowed to share in. Frederick watched everything. He had been born, it seems, with the particular gift of radical attentiveness and ability to see clearly and to hold what he saw, to turn it over in his mind the way you might turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and its edges, until you understood not just its surface but its whole shape. And what he saw at White House shaped him in ways that would take years to fully emerge. He saw the overseer ride through the fields on horseback in the early morning. He saw the men and women bent over the rows, moving steadily through the heat. He heard the sound of the horn that signaled the beginning of work before the sun was fully up, and he heard the bell that ended the day when the light was almost gone. He saw children his own age carrying water to the workers in the field. He saw what happened to those who fell behind, or stumbled, or were judged to have stepped outside the invisible lines that defined acceptable behavior in this world. He saw the violence that kept the system in place. He saw it, and he registered it in his body as children do, not as an abstract horror but as something real and near and specific. He would remember, for the rest of his life, witnessing the whipping of a young woman named Hester, his aunt, a woman of great beauty and spirit, by the enslaver Aaron Anthony, who carried it out in the early morning in the doorway of a storage room while Frederick watched from just inside, pressed against the wall, barely breathing, trying to make himself invisible. He would write about this scene with a directness that is still unsettling to read, not because of the physical detail but because of what he understood about it even as a child, that this was not aberration but system. not deviation but design. He was learning the grammar of his world. But he was also beginning, even then, even at 6 or 7 years old, to learn something else. He was beginning to learn that the world he had been born into was not the only world that existed. And that knowledge, once it entered him, would never leave. Part 2, The City Baltimore and the Sound of an Idea. There is something about cities that opens the world. Not the manufactured bustle of them, not the noise or the crowd, but the simple fact of proximity. In a city, ideas brush against each other in doorways and at street corners. People move from one kind of life toward another, and the distance between those kinds of lives becomes visible in a way it never is when you are deep in the countryside, surrounded by the same horizon, the same trees, the same faces from one season to the next. Baltimore in 1826 was not a small city. It was, in fact, one of the largest and busiest ports on the American East Coast. Its harbor was crowded with merchant ships and oyster schooners and the long elegant forms of clipper ships being built in the yards along the waterfront. Its streets were a mixture of grand townhouses and working-class rowhouses, of cobblestones and open markets, of the smell of sawdust and fish and coal smoke and the salt air rolling in off the bay. Frederick Bailey arrived in Baltimore when he was about 8 years old. He had been lent, that was the term they used, as if he were an object, a tool, a piece of furniture, to Hugh Auld, the brother of his enslaver Thomas Auld, who had recently married. Hugh and Sophia Auld lived in a neighborhood called Fells Point, close to the waterfront, in a brick rowhouse that was modest by the standards of the wealthy but comfortable by the standards of almost everyone else. Their young son Tommy was around Frederick's age, and Frederick was sent to Baltimore, in part, to be a companion to the boy. He later wrote that before leaving for Baltimore, he scrubbed himself thoroughly in the creek, put on his best, his only set of clothes, and felt something he had difficulty naming at the time. Something between hope and the awareness that hope was a dangerous thing for someone in his position to carry. Sophia Auld was, by all accounts of Frederick's own telling, a woman who had not yet been fully formed by the system she lived within. She had not grown up as an enslaver. She was, he wrote, a woman of natural goodness, someone who had not yet learned to look at an enslaved person as something other than a person. When Frederick arrived, she greeted him with something like warmth. She looked at him. She spoke to him as if his understanding mattered. And then she began to teach him to read. This was not uncommon in border states, in urban settings, among people who had not yet been fully shaped by the ideology of the slave system. Reading was not yet, in Sophia Auld's mind, something forbidden. It was simply something children did, and Frederick was a child in her house, so she taught him the alphabet. She pointed to letters in the Bible and named them. She showed him how letters combine to form words, and how words combine to form meaning, and Frederick, with that extraordinary attentiveness he had been born with, absorbed everything she gave him with a speed that surprised her. And then her husband came home. Hugh Auld discovered what was happening, probably saw his wife and Frederick sitting together over a page of text, and he reacted with a sharpness that Frederick would remember for the rest of his life. He told Sophia, in Frederick's hearing, that she must stop immediately. That teaching an enslaved person to read was not only illegal but dangerous. That if you gave a slave an inch, he would take an ell. That a slave who could read was, by definition, unfit to be a slave. That learning would make him unhappy. That it would ruin him for the work he was meant to do. He meant this as a warning. He said it to his wife as a correction, as a piece of practical wisdom that she had not yet acquired. But Frederick heard something entirely different. He heard the shape of the secret he had been kept from. He heard, in Whewell's prohibition, the exact mechanism of the cage. And when you can see the cage clearly, when someone has been careless enough to show you exactly where the bars are and why they are there, you are already, in some essential way, outside it. He wrote about this moment in his autobiography with a clarity that still, nearly 2 centuries later, reads like something illuminated from within. He said that Whewell had done him a greater service than he could ever have intended, that by explaining precisely why enslaved people must not be taught to read, he had explained precisely why Frederick must teach himself. And so Frederick Bailey did. He taught himself to read in the streets of Baltimore, which is to say he used every available resource with a quiet, sustained brilliance. He kept the letters he had already learned from Sophia Auld carefully in his memory. He watched signs on storefronts, on ships, on crates at the dockside market. He got hold of a spelling book, the old Webster's Blueback Speller that was standard in American schoolrooms of the era, and he carried it folded in his shirt. He made a game of challenging the white boys he encountered in Fells Point, daring them to prove they could spell better than he could, letting them teach him the words they spelled, absorbing each lesson with the discipline of someone who understood, absolutely, what was at stake. He found a book. This deserves to be said slowly, because of what it meant. He found a book called The Columbian Orator. The Columbian Orator was a collection of speeches and dialogues, a kind of anthology of rhetorical exemplars that was widely used in American schools at the time. It included speeches by Cicero and William Pitt. It included a dialogue between a master and a slave in which the slave, through the force of reasoned argument, persuades the master of the injustice of slavery. It included a speech by Irish nationalist leader Daniel O'Connell on human freedom. It included the Declaration of Independence. Frederick read this book over and over until he had passages memorized. He read it in the shipyards where he would later work. He read it in the alleyways of Fells Point. He read it by firelight in the evenings when the household was quiet. And with each reading, something in him, something that had been shaped by everything he had witnessed and endured, began to find the language it had been looking for. He also, around this time, taught himself to write. He had noticed that the ship carpenters who worked at the yards in Fells Point marked the timber they were working with letters indicating where each piece of wood would go when the ship was assembled. S for starboard. L for larboard. A for aft. F for forward. He practiced tracing these letters in chalk on fence boards, on pavement, in the dirt of the yard. He copied letters from Tommy's schoolbooks into a copybook of his own when the house was empty, and covered the pages when anyone returned. He was, in secret, becoming what the system had declared he must never become. He began to understand what freedom looked like when it was embodied in a human being walking down a street. He began to understand that it was possible. And in that understanding, still years before he would act on it, the first quiet motion toward escape had already begun. Part 3: The Weight of Knowing, Apprenticeship, Violence, and the Mind That Survived. There is a kind of suffering that is harder to describe than physical pain. It is the suffering of understanding exactly where you are, exactly what is being done to you, and knowing with a clarity that cannot be argued away that the people doing it believe they have every right. It is the suffering of consciousness in a world that has decided your consciousness does not matter, or worse, that it is a threat. Frederick Bailey came to know this suffering in Baltimore, and later, more acutely, when he was sent back to the Eastern Shore. He had lived in Baltimore for several years, from around age 8 until his early teens, and those years had been, relatively speaking, years of relative latitude. Hewald was a shipbuilder and later a caulker, a working man of the Fells Point waterfront, and while the household was governed by the essential injustice of enslaved labor, it operated at a different register of day-to-day cruelty than the large plantations of the tobacco and cotton country. But in 1833, when Frederick was around 15, everything shifted. Aaron Anthony, the man who had been his original enslaver, died. And in the distribution of human property that followed a death in an enslaving household, a process carried out with the same practical language as the division of furniture or livestock, Frederick Bailey was assigned to Thomas Auld, Hugh's brother, who now lived in St. Michael's, a small town on the eastern shore. The return to the eastern shore was, by Frederick's own account, like walking backward into a smaller, darker version of the world. St. Michael's was not Baltimore. It was a small harbor town, surrounded by the same flat, watery landscape he had known as a child, but now he was seeing it through eyes that had read the Columbian Orator and watched free black men walk the streets of a city, and the distance between what he knew was possible and what his life now contained was almost unbearable. Thomas Auld was a man of uncertain temper and insecure character, someone who had acquired status through marriage rather than birth and who used the authority of enslavement partly to compensate for his own sense of inadequacy. Frederick would write about him with a complicated combination of contempt and the strange intimacy that develops between the captive and the captor over years of proximity. In St. Michael's, Frederick made the mistake of trying to continue educating other enslaved people. He organized a Sunday school, a gathering in the woods near the town, where he taught other men and women to read from the New Testament. They met in secret, by quiet arrangement, and for a few weeks it continued without incident. And then a group of white men, led by a local farmer, broke it up. They came with clubs and drove the gathered people away, and that was the end of the Sunday school. The response to this, the response to his continued failure to be entirely broken, was to send Frederick to a man named Edward Covey. Covey was a tenant farmer who had built a particular reputation in Talbot County as a slave-breaker. This was, in the social vocabulary of the time, a specific role, a man who hired out enslaved people from their enslavers and used the period of hire to break whatever spirit or resistance he found in them. He was known for his brutality, yes, but more particularly for a specific kind of psychological mastery. He would appear, without warning, at any moment of the day or night. He moved through his fields in a crouch, hiding behind fences and in the tall rows of corn, watching. You never knew when he was near. You could never relax. And it was this sustained uncertainty, as much as any individual act of violence, that was the mechanism of his particular method. Frederick arrived at Covey's farm in January of 1834. He was 16 years old. The first months there were, by his account, the worst of his life. He was put to work in fields he had no experience with. He had grown up in the city, not on a farm, and every mistake was met with punishment. The work was hard and cold, and the Maryland winter pressed down on the flat fields with a gray, relentless weight. His hands cracked and bled from the cold and the rough work of handling oxen and timber. He was exhausted by midday and kept working past dark. He was, by his own account, losing the person he had been. He described this period later with an image that is as close to poetry as anything in his prose. He said that he was, in those months, a man transformed. That the person who read the Columbian Orator by firelight in Fells Point had become something diminished. A creature of labor and endurance and not much else. That the spirit in him had been so pressed down that he could no longer even be sure it was still there. He wrote about lying in the dirt of the barn one afternoon, unable to rise, not because he was staging a protest but because his body had simply stopped cooperating. He lay there in the warmth of animal breath, the oxen in their stalls around him, the hay dust falling slowly in a shaft of winter light, and thought about the Chesapeake Bay, visible from the fields, and the ships sailing north on it, their white sails moving serenely toward a world that did not include him. He addressed those ships in his mind, in what he later transcribed as one of the most remarkable passages of his autobiography, a long, intimate apostrophe to the freedom of the vessel, the absurdity of his own condition, the water flowing toward a place he could not yet reach. And then, in August of 1834, came the moment that Frederick Douglass would later identify as the turning point of his entire life. Covey found him in the field and began to beat him, to use the kind of sudden, arbitrary violence that was the final guarantee of the system's power. And Frederick did something that astonished both of them. He fought back. He was not larger than Covey. He was not older. He did not have any weapon. But he turned and he held on, and he did not let go, and after 2 hours of wrestling in the dirt of the yard, Covey calling for help that did not effectively come, it was Edward Covey who finally stepped back. Covey never struck Frederick again in the remaining months of his time at the farm. He said nothing about the incident. In the social calculus of the enslaving world, admitting that an enslaved person had successfully resisted him would have been professionally ruinous, and so he absorbed the event in silence and kept his distance. But what the incident meant for Frederick was something else entirely. He wrote that after that day, he was not the same. That something had returned to him, not innocence, he was too old for innocence by then, but will. The conviction that he was a man, not an object. That there was a self in him capable of resistance. That the self could survive. He was 17 years old, and he had just discovered the difference between endurance and resistance, and it would shape everything that followed. Part 4, Ships and Schemes, back to Baltimore and the first attempt. Some things that matter most happen slowly. Not all escapes begin with a single dramatic decision. Some begin with a gathering of small acts, small rebellions, small increments of will applied over months and years, until one day the accumulated pressure becomes something unstoppable, and what seemed impossible reveals itself to have been in preparation all along. After his year with Edward Covey, Frederick Bailey was hired out to a somewhat more lenient farmer named William Freeland, near St. Michael's. The work was still hard and the freedom still absent, but Freeland was, by the standards of the system, less deliberately cruel, and there was more room to breathe. Frederick used that breathing room to organize. Among those who came regularly were 5 men who became the nucleus of something more serious than a school. Their names were Henry Harris, John Harris, Henry Bailey, Charles Roberts, and Sandy Jenkins. They were young men, most of them in their 20s, and in the low firelight of these secret gatherings, they began to speak about something they had perhaps never said aloud before. They began to speak about escape. In the spring of 1836, Frederick and these 5 men made a plan. It was not a sophisticated plan by the standards of the escape network that would develop later in the century. There was no formal organization to contact, no chain of safe houses fully established along a northern route. What they had was a stolen canoe, a borrowed piece of paper, and a rough idea of the geography between them and the Free States. The plan was to paddle north along the Chesapeake Bay, following the shoreline until they reached the Pennsylvania state line, and from there to make their way to the Free Territories on foot. They would carry a paper, forged in Frederick's hand, for he was the only one of the group with enough literacy to do it, that would serve as a pass, documenting their freedom and authorizing their travel northward. This paper, this forged document, was the linchpin of everything. The pass system was one of the primary tools through which the slave system controlled movement. Enslaved people generally could not move beyond their enslaver's property without written permission from their enslaver, and the ability to produce that permission on demand was what stood between the appearance of free movement and immediate capture. A pass did not guarantee safety. Slave catchers and local authorities could question the document, or simply ignore it, but it provided a thin layer of legal camouflage, a plausible story in a world where stories were the difference between one fate and another. Frederick forged the passes carefully. He had been practicing his handwriting for years, and the documents he produced were plausible. They named each man by name and attested that he had permission from his enslaver to travel north to Baltimore for work. The night of the planned departure came. The men gathered. And then the plan collapsed. They were betrayed, someone talked, or someone's fear finally became too large to contain, or some combination of information reached the ears of the local authority. Before they could reach the water, they were arrested. Frederick and the Harris brothers and the others were taken, bound, and marched through the town of St. Michael's, a procession of young men whose bid for freedom had lasted exactly as long as it took for someone to decide it was too dangerous to keep the secret. It was, by any measure, a devastating blow. Frederick was jailed in Easton, the county seat of Talbot County, and he stayed there for about a week while Thomas Auld decided what to do with him. The expectation, the conventional logic of the system, was that enslaved people who attempted escape were sold south. Sold into the deep cotton country of Alabama or Mississippi, where the conditions were by most accounts far worse than Maryland, and where the distances from any northern state were so vast as to make escape effectively impossible. Frederick waited in the jail in Easton, looking through the bars at the street outside, knowing that the next decision might be the one that determined every remaining day of his life. And then Thomas Auld surprised him. Auld did not sell himself. He sent him back to Baltimore, back to Hugh Auld, to work in the shipyards of Fells Point. The reasons are not entirely clear from the historical record. Perhaps Thomas Auld thought the proximity of the city and its free black community had been the source of Frederick's trouble and the countryside would teach him differently. Perhaps there was a financial arrangement involved. Perhaps there was some other calculation. Whatever the reason, Frederick was returned to Baltimore. He arrived back in the city that had first opened the world to him, and he was now older, sharper, more certain of what he wanted and more aware of exactly how difficult it was going to be to get it. He was put to work as a caulker in the shipyards. Caulking was a skilled trade, the work of driving oakum, a kind of fiber, into the seams of wooden ships to make them watertight, using a mallet and a caulking iron. It was loud, physical, rhythmic work, carried out against the backdrop of the immense activity of the Fells Point waterfront, the hammering of the shipwrights, the creak and splash of vessels being launched, the shouted orders of the yard foreman, the smell of tar and pine resin and sawdust hanging in the salt air. Frederick was good at it. He had a strong and precise way with his hands, and within a relatively short time he was one of the better caulkers in the yard. And because of the peculiar economics of urban enslavement in Baltimore, he was allowed to hire himself out, which is to say he could arrange his own work with various ship captains and yard owners, provided he turned over a substantial portion of his earnings to Hugh Auld each week. This arrangement had a particular cruelty at its core. He was doing skilled work, earning skilled wages, moving through the city with relative freedom, and then handing the fruits of that labor to a man who had done nothing to earn it, on the basis of a legal claim to Frederick's person that Frederick found increasingly impossible to accept. But it also had something that proved essential. It gave him mobility. It gave him contacts. and through the social world of Baltimore's black community, free and enslaved both, moving in and out of the churches and meetings and social gatherings that constituted the connective tissue of that community, it gave him the beginning of something he had not had in 1836. It gave him a future escape route. And it gave him, in a church in East Baltimore, the woman who would walk out of Maryland beside him when the time came. Part 5, Anna and the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society. Let us pause here for a moment and speak of Anna Murray. Anna Murray was born free. She was the eighth child of two formerly enslaved people, Barbara Murray and Mary Murray, who had been emancipated in 1800, around the time of Anna's birth in Denton, Caroline County, Maryland. She had grown up free in a region where freedom for black people was always a relative and fragile thing, legally recognized but practically circumscribed, a different quality of life than the slavery all around it, but not the untroubled freedom that the word implied for white Americans of the same era. She had come to Baltimore in her early 20s to work as a domestic laborer for a series of white households, a common occupation for free black women in the city, a way of earning wages and maintaining a degree of independence. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable practicality and quiet strength. She was an excellent laundress and seamstress. She was organized and careful with money, saving a portion of her wages with the steady discipline of someone who had a longer view in mind. She was also, by the time she met Frederick Bailey, deeply embedded in the social and spiritual community of the East Baltimore Free Black community. They met through the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, a gathering of free black men and women that met regularly for discussion, debate, and self-improvement, in the tradition of the various such societies that had been forming in the urban black communities of the North and the border states since the early part of the century. These were serious, intentional gatherings. People read papers and gave speeches and debated current events and the moral questions of the day. They were, in a sense, practice grounds for the public intellectual life that the broader white society denied black Americans access to. Frederick came to the society and he came to life in it. He had been educating himself for years, had been accumulating language and argument and the specific pleasure of a mind fully engaged with ideas, but in the society he found an audience, and an audience changes a speaker the way water changes a stone, slowly revealing the shape that was always there. He spoke with a force and a clarity that stood out even in a room of thoughtful people. He argued. He listened. He revised. He became, in this relatively small theater, what he would eventually become on a very large one. And he fell in love with Anna Murray. We know less about Anna's inner life than we know about Frederick's, because Anna, unlike Frederick, did not write extensively about herself, and the historical record has treated her with the particular invisibility that it has historically extended to black women. We know what she did. We know the practical intelligence of her choices. We know that she looked at Frederick Bailey and saw both the man and the future he was reaching for, and she decided to reach with him. When Frederick began planning his second escape, Anna Murray was central to it. She contributed money, her own carefully saved wages, to fund the escape. She helped acquire, or may have helped sew, the sailor's uniform that he would wear on the day. She was part of the plan in a way that the history books have sometimes reduced to a footnote, but which Frederick himself acknowledged, saying that he owed his escape in large part to her support. And she stayed. This is worth dwelling on. Anna Murray, who was free and who had a life and a community in Baltimore, chose to wait to remain in the city while Frederick made his escape and then to follow him north once he had established contact. She chose this knowing that his escape, if discovered, could implicate her. she chose this knowing the risk. She chose this because she loved him and because she believed in what he was doing. She would remain, for much of her life, slightly off to the side of his story. But tonight, in this telling, she is at its center. Because without Anna Murray's belief, and Anna Murray's money, and Anna Murray's willingness to risk everything for a future she could not yet see, the escape that changed Frederick Bailey into Frederick Douglass might never have happened at all. Part 6: The Planned Disguise, Documentation, and the Geometry of Flight. Consider the distance between Baltimore and Philadelphia. On a modern map, it does not look like much. 100 miles, perhaps a little more, the two cities connected by a corridor of highway and rail that today can be crossed in a comfortable hour or two. A familiar, unremarkable stretch of the mid-Atlantic landscape, the low pine forests of Delaware, the flat farmland of Chester County, the gradual suburban thickening as you approach the Delaware River and the bridge that carries you into Pennsylvania. But in September of 1838, that distance was something entirely different. That distance was a gauntlet. Every road and rail line between Maryland and Pennsylvania was patrolled, not necessarily with a formal police presence, but with the informal, omnipresent authority of a system that had a very strong interest in preventing enslaved people from reaching free soil. Railroad conductors were required by Maryland law to check the documentation of black passengers. Conductors who failed to do this, or who knowingly transported fugitive enslaved people, faced legal consequences. Ferry operators, toll road keepers, innkeepers, all were part of a network of surveillance that the slave system maintained at its margins, where the land of slavery ended and the land of nominal freedom began. All of this was known to Frederick Bailey in September of 1838, as he and Anna Murray and a small circle of trusted people finalized the plan. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its dependence on things going right. Frederick would travel north by rail, the rail line that ran from Baltimore through Wilmington, Delaware, and on to Philadelphia. He would travel not as himself but as a sailor, a free black seaman, using borrowed documentation that identified him as such. He would travel on a Monday, because enslaved people who were away from their enslavers over a weekend were typically not immediately noticed until the following week, and a Monday departure gave him the maximum window before his absence would be reported. The sailor's disguise was Anna Murray's contribution, at least in part. She helped procure a sailor's uniform, the loose trousers and red shirt and tarpaulin hat that were standard working dress for the merchant seamen of the Chesapeake, and Frederick would wear it, carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who had been on the water all his life, which, given the years on the Fells Point waterfront, was not entirely untrue, and trust that the uniform, combined with the documentation, combined with his own ability to inhabit a role, would carry him through. The documentation was the most dangerous variable. He could not forge documents this time. The lesson of 1836 had been that forged passes, however well executed, were ultimately detectable, and detection meant capture. What he had instead was borrowed documentation, papers belonging to a free black sailor who was willing to lend them. The papers contained a physical description of the sailor, and that description did not precisely match Frederick. The height was approximately right. The general description, a black man, seafaring age, was plausible. But there were discrepancies that could be fatal if anyone looked too closely. This was the nature of the gamble. Not that it was impossible, but that it required a sustained performance under conditions of extreme stress, in the presence of people who had both the authority and the incentive to look carefully. Frederick Bailey had been preparing for this performance, in a sense, for years. He had watched how men moved when they felt entitled to the space they occupied. He had watched free men, black and white both, on the streets of Baltimore, and he had observed the subtle grammar of posture, of eye contact, of the easy, unconcerned way a man moves when he does not believe anyone has the right to question him. He practiced this in his mind. He rehearsed the confidence not as an emotion, he was not feeling confident, it would be dishonest to say he was, but as a physical fact, a set of behaviors he would produce regardless of what was happening internally. The day before he left, he went to the shipyard and caulked. He worked his normal day. He spoke to no one about what was coming. He turned over his week's wages to Hewald as required. He came home, ate, slept, or tried to sleep. And in the morning, in the gray before dawn, he dressed in the sailor's clothes. He put on the red shirt and the loose trousers. He adjusted the tarpaulin hat. He looked at himself in what mirror or reflection the small room afforded and saw a sailor. Or tried to see a sailor. Or tried to see someone who could convincingly be a sailor in the eyes of every person he would encounter between this room and the Free States. And then he went out into the morning. He had very little time. The train departed on a schedule, and he could not afford to miss it, and he could not afford to arrive too early and attract attention by waiting too long. He walked toward the train station with his body carrying the performance he had rehearsed, and the rest of him, the part that knew what failure meant, he kept very still and very quiet, somewhere deep inside, where no one could see it. Part 7. The train, minute by minute through the gauntlet. The station at Baltimore was busy on that Monday morning, the 3rd of September, 1838. It was not the grand marble and glass station that would come later, this was the earlier infrastructure of American rail, built in the late 1820s and early 1830s, when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was one of the first serious attempts to connect the eastern seaboard by iron rail. The cars were wooden, pulled by a steam locomotive that huffed and clanked at the platform, throwing off the smell of coal smoke and hot metal and hot oil into the morning air. People moved through the station in the way people move through any transit space, with the slightly distracted forward lean of those who are thinking about where they are going rather than where they are. Bags and trunks were loaded. Goodbyes were said. Conductors moved along the platform with the settled authority of men who had done this 1,000 times. Frederick Bailey walked onto the platform and onto the train. He sat down in the car for black passengers, for even here, even in the transitional space between the slave state and the free state, the cars were segregated by race, and black travelers occupied the separate and generally less comfortable section, and he settled himself. He arranged his posture. He breathed. The train began to move. The conductor came through the car. This was the first test, and Frederick knew it. The conductor was legally required to check the papers of black passengers, and he moved through the car with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. He reached Frederick, looked at him, asked for his papers. Frederick produced the sailor's documentation. The conductor looked at it. Then looked at Frederick. Then looked back at the paper. He gave the conductor the sailor's papers. The conductor took a brief look, handed them back, and moved on. It was that close, and that simple, and that terrifying. But the train had barely cleared the edge of Baltimore when the next danger appeared. A man boarded the car who knew Frederick. Or who recognized him, a German blacksmith named Frederick Stewart, who had worked with him at the shipyards, who knew his face. The man looked at him, and Frederick felt the recognition pass through the air between them like a current. He met the man's eyes and nodded with the calm assurance of someone who had no particular interest in being recognized. The blacksmith looked at him, looked at the uniform, the hat, the posture, and something uncertain moved across his face, and then he looked away. Whether he was convinced or simply chose not to become involved in something that felt complicated, Frederick never knew. But the man said nothing, moved to another part of the car, and the train kept moving north. Delaware. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, which you would have been able to see from the train window, the long flat cut through the low land, the water still and gleaming in the morning light. The border between Maryland and Delaware crossed somewhere in that flat, boggy terrain, and Frederick, watching the landscape pass, watching each cluster of houses, each station platform, knew that the crossing of a border did not mean the crossing into safety, only the crossing into a different quality of danger. At Wilmington, the passengers had to leave the train and cross the Delaware River by ferry to reach the rail connection on the Pennsylvania side. This was another choke point, another moment of inspection, another opportunity for things to go wrong. Frederick walked from the train to the ferry with the other passengers. He was not running, not hesitating, the discipline of his performance was holding. On the ferry, he encountered a man he knew, a free black man who was himself traveling north and who looked at Frederick with something between surprise and alarm, clearly recognizing him and clearly understanding what was happening. He said nothing to Frederick, made no acknowledgement, and took his position on the far side of the ferry deck. They crossed the river in parallel without speaking, two men who shared a secret neither would name aloud. On the Pennsylvania bank, there was a Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad train waiting to carry passengers north into Pennsylvania. Frederick got on. The Pennsylvania train was different, not in its physical form, perhaps, but in what it represented. Once the train was moving north through Chester County, through those flat agricultural lands where the farms were worked by free people and the soil was not stained by the particular history of Maryland, something in the quality of the air around Frederick began to change. Or perhaps it was not the air but his ability to breathe it. He had not been caught. The fields were moving past the window in the slow, rhythmic way of landscapes viewed from a moving train, and the morning light was coming through the glass at a low September angle, touching the stubble of cut hay in the fields and the red barns and the white farmhouses with a kind of ordinary, unremarkable grace. It was a beautiful morning. It was an ordinary morning for everyone else on the train. For Frederick Bailey, it was the morning of everything. The train pulled into Philadelphia, and he got off, and he walked through the station, and he was in a free state. Legally, nominally, contingently free, the fugitive slave law still made him vulnerable, and he knew this, and he did not stay in Philadelphia but continued on, by steamboat and rail, to New York City. He arrived in New York on the 4th of September, 1838. He had been traveling for less than 24 hours. He had left Maryland a slave. He arrived in New York City a man. Part 8, New York, the city that was not yet safe. New York City in the autumn of 1838 was not the gleaming city of later decades. It was a city of energy and contradiction, one of the largest ports in the world, a place where fortunes were made and lost with equal speed, where new immigrants arrived in daily waves and the streets of Lower Manhattan were full of a dozen languages and the smells of a dozen different cuisines. It was a city with a substantial free black population, a city with active abolitionists, a city with newspapers that argued loudly and often about slavery and free labor and the future of the Republic. It was also a city where Frederick Bailey was not safe. Frederick arrived knowing no one in the city. He had a small amount of money, whatever remained from the funds that Anna Murray had contributed, and he had managed to keep through the journey, and he had the address of a man he had heard about in Baltimore, a free black man named David Ruggles who was involved in the network that would later come to be called the Underground Railroad. David Ruggles was, by any measure, a remarkable man. He was a journalist, a bookseller, and one of the most active conductors of the early Freedom Network, a man who in several years of this work had helped shelter and route more than 600 fugitive enslaved people through New York to safer destinations in the free North. He was also under constant surveillance by the authorities and by slave-catching interests who found him a significant obstacle to their operations. Frederick found his way to Ruggles's house, and Ruggles took him in. The days he spent in New York before Anna Murray arrived were days of a particular suspended quality, days in which he was free and not free, in a city that was his and was also dangerous, in which the past was behind him and the future had not yet taken any particular shape. He walked the streets of Lower Manhattan with the careful wariness of someone who knows that at any moment a face might appear that recognized him, that any encounter with a law enforcement officer or a suspicious stranger could undo everything. He wrote later about these days with an ambivalence that is unusual in his prose. He was not triumphant in these pages, not yet. The relief of having crossed the border had not yet become joy. It was something more complicated, a kind of disoriented alertness, the sensation of having been running for a long time and suddenly finding the ground had changed beneath you and you weren't sure yet if it would hold. He described New York City as a place that made him feel like a man who had escaped from a den of hungry lions only to find himself in a new environment full of different, more subtle dangers. The lions were still somewhere nearby. He just could not see them clearly. Anna Murray arrived several days after Frederick, and Ruggles wasted no time in arranging their marriage. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend James W. C. Pennington, himself a fugitive from enslavement, a man who had escaped from Maryland years earlier and had gone on to educate himself and become a minister and theologian of considerable standing. That a man who had himself once been enslaved should perform the marriage ceremony of two people beginning their free life together is the kind of historical detail that the sleep mind turns over slowly, feeling its meaning from different angles. They were married in Ruggles's parlor, quietly, with very little ceremony. And then they left New York. They went by steamboat and stagecoach, arriving in New Bedford sometime in early September. A man named Nathan Johnson, a free black resident of the city, hosted them until they could find their own footing. And it was Nathan Johnson who gave Frederick Bailey something he had been planning to give himself: a new name. Frederick had been thinking about this. He had decided, before he even left Maryland, that if he escaped, he would change his name. The name Frederick Bailey was his enslaved name, the name attached to the records and notices and the legal paperwork of his bondage. As a new man in a new life, he needed a new name. He kept Frederick. He wanted to keep the first name his mother had given him, the only gift from her he was certain of. But he needed a new surname, something that would not appear on any handbill or slave notice. Nathan Johnson was reading Walter Scott's long narrative poem, The Lady of the Lake, and in it there was a Scottish chieftain named James of Douglas, a man of dignity and courage. Nathan Johnson suggested that Frederick take the name Douglas, with the extra S added for distinction, and Frederick Bailey agreed. He would be Frederick Douglass. From that moment on, he was. Part 9, New Bedford Learning to Live in Freedom. New Bedford in the 1830s and 1840s was one of the most prosperous cities in the United States. But New Bedford was also a city with an unusually large and vibrant free black community. It was a city with Quaker roots and a tradition of anti-slavery sentiment, and the combination of maritime employment, which was significantly less segregated than many land-based industries, and that ideological tradition had created a place where black men and women could live with a degree of freedom and dignity that was genuinely unusual for the period. Frederick Douglass arrived in this city and found a world he had not imagined. He went to work. He had been a skilled caulker in Baltimore, and he expected to find work in the shipyards, but encountered instead the first of many demonstrations that racism was not the exclusive property of the slave states. The white caulkers of New Bedford threatened to strike if any black caulker was employed alongside them in the yards, and so Frederick, who had a skill that should have been immediately useful, found himself unable to use it. He did not stop. He took every other kind of work he could find. He sawed wood. He drove a coach. He loaded and unloaded ships. He shoveled coal and cleared snow and did whatever labor the city offered, and he was not humiliated by any of it, because he had understood something that the years of captivity had made absolutely clear: the difference between working hard at an honest job and being worked hard at someone else's profit was the difference between everything and nothing. And he found the community he had been reaching toward. New Bedford had an African Methodist Episcopal Zion church, and Frederick joined it. The church was a gathering place for the free black community of the city, a space for worship and also for the social and political conversation that the broader white community largely refused to have with black people on equal terms. Here, Frederick found men and women who were navigating the same contradictions he was navigating: the freedom that was real and the freedom that was still theoretical, the legal emancipation and the daily reality of discrimination, the gap between what the country said it believed and what it actually did. He also encountered, for the first time in any systematic way, the organized anti-slavery movement. He began reading William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. The Liberator was perhaps the most radical anti-slavery publication in the country, a Boston-based newspaper that had been arguing, since its founding in 1831, for the immediate and unconditional abolition of slavery, without compensation to enslavers and without compromise. Garrison himself was a Boston abolitionist of tremendous conviction and sometimes difficult temperament, a man who had staked his entire public identity on a position, immediate, unconditional abolition, that most of even his reform-minded contemporaries found too extreme. Frederick read The Liberator the way a man reads something that says, finally, exactly what he has been thinking. He subscribed. He read every issue. He read Garrison's editorials and the speeches reproduced in the paper and the reports from anti-slavery meetings around New England, and something in him that had been accumulating for years, the language learned from the Columbian orator, the experience of life in the slave system and life outside it, the particular knowledge of someone who has been inside the thing being argued about, began to find its occasion. That occasion arrived in August of 1841, at an anti-slavery convention on the island of Nantucket. Frederick had been persuaded to attend the convention by a black friend, and when the moment came, when one of the organizers turned to the audience and asked if anyone else wished to speak, he stood up. He was 23 years old. He had never spoken to a white audience. He was, in his own account, terrified. His hands were shaking. The room was full of people, mostly white, who had come to hear polished speeches from professional reformers. He began to speak. What he said in that first speech is not recorded verbatim, the record is fragmentary, and he himself remembered it only in outline. But the response is recorded, by people who were there. They said it was extraordinary. Not because it was polished, it was not, but because of what it carried. Because the man speaking had been there. He had been inside the thing they were arguing about theoretically, and when he stood up and opened his mouth, the reality of it entered the room in a way that their careful arguments had not quite managed. William Lloyd Garrison himself was in the audience. He rose after Frederick sat down and asked the crowd, "Have we been listening to a thing, a piece of property, or a man?" And the room answered him. Frederick Douglass had just become something he had been in the process of becoming for his entire life. There is a kind of courage that is spectacular and visible, the courage of the night escape, the forged papers, the train through the gauntlet. And then there is another kind of courage, quieter and in some ways more sustained, which is the courage of standing in a room full of people who have not lived what you have lived and giving them, in language, the shape of your truth. Frederick Douglass had both kinds of courage. He was very good at this. And then, as the months of lecturing extended into years, something began to complicate the role he had been given. The problem was that Frederick Douglass was too eloquent. This sounds paradoxical, so let us sit with it for a moment. When he first began lecturing, people in the audiences sometimes challenged him, sometimes doubted, openly, that he had actually been enslaved, because he spoke with such ease and clarity and force that it seemed inconsistent with what they imagined an enslaved man's education could have produced. He was, in other words, too educated, too articulate, to fit the image of the enslaved person that his audiences had constructed in their imaginations. His advisors in the anti-slavery movement, including Garrison himself, advised him to keep his speeches simple, to tell his story without too much flourish, to resist the temptation to argue broadly and philosophically. The implicit message was that his role was to testify, not to theorize, and that his credibility as a witness depended on not appearing too polished, too capable, too much like someone who might have educated himself out of the system entirely. Frederick Douglass received this advice, and then he did what he always did when given instructions that conflicted with his understanding of the truth. He set them aside. In 1845, he published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. It was a book that named names, named his enslavers, named the farms and the counties, gave specific dates and locations that could be verified. It was a book that could not be dismissed as fiction or invention by those who doubted his story, because it was too detailed, too specific, too verifiable. It was also a book of extraordinary literary power, a book that begins with childhood and moves toward freedom, and a narrative arc that manages to be simultaneously a personal memoir, a political argument, and a work of American literature. It read, as one contemporary reviewer noted, like nothing that had quite existed before. It was not the kind of writing you expected from a man who had been denied access to education for the first decade and a half of his life. The book was a sensation. It went through multiple printings almost immediately and sold tens of thousands of copies in the United States and in England. It was translated into several European languages. It made Frederick Douglass's name in a way that years of lecturing had not quite managed, because a book can travel where a speaker cannot, and a book does not disappear when the hall empties. But the book also created a new danger. By naming names and places, Frederick Douglass had made it possible for his legal owner, Thomas Auld, who still held legal title to him under the laws of Maryland, to identify him precisely and to seek his return. The fugitive slave law was still in effect. Thomas Auld could, in theory, hire slave catchers and have Frederick Douglass returned to Maryland in chains. This was not a theoretical risk. It was a real one, and Frederick knew it, and the people around him knew it, and the solution was to leave the country. He sailed to the British Isles in August of 1845. He spent approximately 19 months in Ireland and Great Britain, an extraordinary period that coincided, in Ireland, with the beginning of the Great Famine, and that exposed him to a different and more complex vision of human suffering and political injustice than even his American experience had provided. He lectured throughout Ireland and England and Scotland, and he was received everywhere with what he found profoundly affecting, not as a novelty or a curiosity, but as an intellectual and moral equal. He wrote to William Lloyd Garrison from Dublin in September of 1845, "I breathe in low. The chattel becomes a man." He was describing the sensation of moving through a society that did not legally define him as property, though he was clear-eyed enough to observe that British society had its own profound injustices, its own hierarchies of suffering, its own people ground down by systems of power and deprivation. He made those observations too, with the same unflinching attentiveness he had brought to everything else. In England, British anti-slavery supporters, moved by his lectures and by his book, arranged to purchase his legal freedom from Thomas Auld. The price was $150. The transaction was completed in December of 1846, and Frederick Douglass became, for the first time in his life, legally free in the country that claimed to be founded on the proposition that all men are created equal. He returned to the United States in April of 1847, and he returned with plans. He had been offered money by British supporters, a substantial gift, and he used it to establish a newspaper. He moved his family to Rochester, New York, and there, in 1847, he founded the North Star, a newspaper whose motto was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." The name itself was a deliberate and resonant choice. The North Star, Polaris, the fixed point in the northern sky, was the guide that escaped enslaved people had used for generations to navigate their way north in the darkness. It was the star that Frederick himself might have watched from the deck of a ship or through the trees of a Maryland night, the point of light that oriented you when everything else was disorienting. To name a newspaper after it was to say, "This is how we navigate. This is the fixed point." The North Star would later become Frederick Douglass's paper, and it would continue publication for many years, making Frederick Douglass not only one of the most powerful lecturers in the abolitionist movement but one of its most important editors and journalists. He wrote. He argued. He evolved. And the evolution of his thinking, from the immediate abolitionism of Garrison, with its rejection of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, toward a more politically engaged abolitionism that saw the Constitution not as a hopeless compromise with slavery but as a document whose stated ideals could be turned against the institution itself. This evolution was one of the most significant intellectual journeys in American public life in the mid-19th century. The break with Garrison was painful and public. Garrison and Douglass had been close, mentor and protege, fellow travelers in a cause that both believed in absolutely. But their disagreement about strategy and doctrine was genuine, and it deepened over the years until the relationship fractured entirely in the early 1850s. Garrison's movement held that the Constitution was fundamentally a pro-slavery document, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the protections for the international slave trade until 1808 all pointed in that direction, and that genuine abolitionists should refuse to participate in the political process built on that document. Douglass came to believe, with increasing conviction, that this position left the most powerful levers of change untouched. He began to argue for political engagement. He began to argue that the phrase "we the people" and the guarantee of liberty in the preamble could be read as a mandate for abolition, that the founding documents contained, within their own stated principles, the tools for their own fulfillment. This was a more complicated argument than Garrison's, but it was also, arguably, a more American one, and it would prove to be the more historically significant one. By the early 1850s, Frederick Douglass was the most prominent black intellectual and political figure in the United States. He was corresponding with politicians at every level of American public life. He had met with President Millard Fillmore. He was in communication with the abolitionist John Brown, whose ideas about direct, violent resistance to slavery Frederick took seriously, though he ultimately could not follow Brown's logic all the way to Harper's Ferry. When John Brown was executed in 1859, following his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, a raid intended to spark an armed slave uprising and that ended instead in catastrophic failure and Brown's capture, Frederick Douglass was implicated by association and briefly had to flee to Canada and then to England to avoid arrest. He returned after the political temperature had cooled, to find the country moving rapidly toward a confrontation that everyone could feel coming. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The secession of the Southern states. The firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. The Civil War. Frederick Douglass understood immediately what the war meant and what it must become. He understood it before Lincoln's administration was ready to say it publicly, that the war could not be fought to preserve the Union without also destroying slavery, because slavery was the reason the Union had broken. You could not separate the two questions. The wound and the wound's cause were the same thing. He used his newspaper and his lecture platform to press this argument with relentless force. He pushed for the enlistment of black soldiers, arguing that black men must be allowed not only to benefit from the war but to fight in it, to stake their physical bodies as well as their political arguments in the contest over what America would become. When the Lincoln administration finally moved toward this position, slowly, and under enormous political pressure from multiple directions, it was in part because Frederick Douglass had been making the case, louder and more persistently than almost anyone else, for 2 years. He met with Lincoln. This meeting, held in August of 1863, in the middle of the war, in the White House, was one of the most remarkable encounters in American political history. Frederick Douglass, a man who had been legally owned as property 25 years earlier, walked into the executive mansion and met with the President of the United States. He sat with Lincoln and argued the case for equal pay for black soldiers, for the equal treatment of black prisoners of war captured by Confederate forces, for the recognition that black men fighting and dying for the Union deserved the same formal dignity as white men doing the same. Lincoln received him with what Frederick described, somewhat to his own surprise, as genuine respect. The President listened. He did not promise everything Frederick asked. But he listened and he responded with what appeared to be actual thought, actual engagement, the behavior of a man who was taking the arguments seriously rather than performing consideration. They met again in August of 1864, and once more, in the days following Lincoln's second inauguration in March of 1865. After the inaugural ceremony, after Lincoln had delivered the extraordinary speech that concluded with "Malice toward none, with charity for all," there was a reception at the White House. Frederick Douglass attended and was initially refused entry by the guards. He sent word to Lincoln, who had him admitted. Lincoln greeted him in the receiving line and said, in front of the assembled guests, "Here comes my friend Douglass." He said, "I saw you in the crowd today, listening to my inaugural address. How did you like it?" Frederick told him it was a sacred effort. Lincoln said he was glad he thought so. 6 weeks later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Frederick Douglass spoke at memorial services. He wrote. He continued. He always continued. Part 11, After the War: Reconstruction, Betrayal, and the Long Remainder. What does it feel like when the thing you have worked for your entire life finally, partially, incompletely happens? When the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in December of 1865, abolishing slavery throughout the nation, Frederick Douglass was 47 years old. He had been fighting for this moment in various ways, with various tools, from the first moment he understood what was being done to him and why, for his entire conscious life. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 had been a beginning, a military and political declaration that had the force of law only in the Confederate States and only under the legal cover of wartime necessity. The 13th Amendment was the constitutional foundation, the permanent, formal abolition that the proclamation had not quite been. He wept when he heard it had passed. He had said, publicly, that he would believe it when he saw it, because he had been disappointed by the pace and the timidity of American progress on this question too many times to trust any particular development with uncomplicated hope. But when it happened, when the vote was confirmed and the amendment was ratified, the relief of it, the enormity of it, was something he allowed himself to feel. And then he looked at what came next, and he saw immediately that the work was far from done. The period called Reconstruction, roughly 1865 to 1877, was one of the most complex and ultimately tragic periods in American political history. It was an attempt, backed by federal law and federal military power, to integrate 4 million formerly enslaved people into the civic and political life of the country that had held them in bondage. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote to black men. Black men were elected to the United States Congress and to state legislatures across the South. Courts were integrated, schools were built, the framework of a more equitable society was, for a brief and extraordinary moment, actually being constructed. Frederick Douglass supported all of this and argued for more. He pushed, in these years, for the full integration of black citizens into American political life, for land distribution to the formerly enslaved, the promise of 40 acres that the government gestured toward and then withdrew, for education, for legal protection, for the recognition that emancipation without economic foundation was a partial and vulnerable freedom. He also argued, in these years, for women's suffrage. This was a position that brought him into conflict with some of his former allies in the abolitionist movement, who were willing to support black male suffrage while opposing or deprioritizing the extension of the vote to women of any race. Frederick Douglass had been a supporter of women's rights since 1848, when he attended the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in the United States, and signed its Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. He had argued for women's suffrage for decades, and he continued to argue for it in the Reconstruction period, even when doing so complicated his political alliances. But Reconstruction was, in the end, dismantled. The Compromise of 1877, the political deal that ended the contested presidential election of 1876 by giving the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively ended Reconstruction. Without federal enforcement, the protections of the 14th and 15th Amendments proved to be paper protections. The former Confederate states moved systematically to re-establish the social and political hierarchy that had predated the war, using new mechanisms, black codes, poll taxes, literacy tests, convict leasing, the systematic violence of white supremacist terror groups, to accomplish in the law what slavery had accomplished by ownership. Frederick Douglass watched this happen and spoke against it. He was not the only one. But the forces arrayed against black citizenship in the post-Reconstruction South were powerful and determined, and the political will to resist them in Washington had been exhausted or corrupted, and the results were devastating. He continued his public life through these years. He was appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia in 1877, making him the first black American to hold that office. He was later appointed Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. In 1889, he was appointed U.S. Minister to Haiti, the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere, founded by the only successful slave revolution in the history of the Americas, a country whose very existence was an uncomfortable fact for the slaveholding world that had tried to quarantine it and that the United States had refused to formally recognize until the Civil War. These were positions of honor and some influence, and he took them seriously. But he also knew, and said, clearly and repeatedly, that the official recognition of individual black men in positions of institutional power was not the same thing as the systemic change that 4 million newly freed people needed and deserved. He was never complacent about the gap between symbolic progress and structural change. He revised his autobiography twice, publishing My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855 and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881, with a revised edition in 1892. Each version was a different document, reflecting a different moment and a different author, younger, older, more certain, more complicated, looking back on the same events from greater and greater distance. Together, the three autobiographies constitute one of the most remarkable self-portraits in American literature, the record of a single consciousness encountering its world across a lifetime of enormous change. Anna Murray Douglass died in August of 1882, after 44 years of marriage. Frederick was deeply affected by her death, though the public record of his grief is less extensive than one might expect. He was already, by this point, a figure who inhabited a primarily public world, and the private dimension of his life, the domestic reality of the house in Rochester, and later the grand home called Cedar Hill in Anacostia, Washington, D.C., had always been somewhat separated from the public narrative. He responded to these critics with characteristic directness. When asked about the marriage, he noted that his first wife was the color of his mother and his second wife was the color of his father, a response that contained, in its compact reference to his own origins, his own life, everything he had been from the beginning. He would not apologize for loving whom he loved. He would not structure his most intimate choices according to other people's political comfort. He came back to Cedar Hill, the house on the hill in Anacostia that he had purchased in 1877, a large, comfortable Victorian house with a view across the river to the capital of the United States, a view that was itself a kind of argument, a man who had been owned looking out from his own home at the building where the laws that had owned him had been written and were being remade. He continued to speak. His last public speech was in February of 1895, at a women's rights meeting in Washington, D.C. After the meeting, he returned to Cedar Hill and died that evening of a heart attack, having attended a women's rights convention on the last day of his life, arguing for a cause he had embraced nearly 50 years before. He was 77 years old. He had been born on the eastern shore of Maryland, in the first light of the 19th century, to a woman who visited him in darkness and left before the dawn. He had been property. He had been called a thing. He had been told, in language and in practice, every day of his early life, that he was less than human. And then he got on a train. And everything that followed, the speeches, the newspaper, the books, the meetings with presidents, the arguments for human dignity that reached across the Atlantic and echoed through the decades, everything that followed began with one young man in a sailor's uniform, carrying borrowed papers, stepping onto a platform in Baltimore in the gray of a September morning, and deciding that the world they had built to contain him was simply not going to hold. Part 12, Legacy, What He Left in the Air. Some people pass through the world and leave it as they found it. And some people pass through the world and the world is different in their wake, not because they commanded armies or controlled economies, but because they understood something clearly, and they said it, and they kept saying it, and eventually the saying of it changed the shape of what was possible to think. Frederick Douglass was the second kind. It is worth pausing, at this quiet late hour, to consider what he actually changed, not in the abstract language of historical significance, but in the specific, tangible sense of what was different because he existed and did what he did. He changed the public conversation about slavery in America. The books mattered. They still matter. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is still in print, still assigned in schools and universities, still read by people who find in its 150 pages something that larger and more celebrated works sometimes fail to deliver: the direct, unadorned, specific account of what it was actually like to be inside the most defining moral catastrophe of American history. He changed the political calculus around black citizenship. His argument that the Constitution, properly understood, was not a pro-slavery document but an anti-slavery one, that its principles were in fundamental tension with the institution of enslavement, and that the political process built on that Constitution was therefore a legitimate arena for the struggle for abolition. This argument became the dominant position of the abolitionist movement in the decade before the Civil War, and it was the argument that ultimately prevailed. It was the argument that connected the founding documents to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It was the argument that Lincoln, in his way, was making when he framed the war not merely as a conflict about union but as the unfinished business of the founding generation. He demonstrated, in the most personal and irrefutable way possible, that the claims of the slave system about the intellectual and moral capacities of black people were not only wrong but absurd. This may sound like a modest achievement, given that the claim being refuted was so obviously false that it seems barely worth refuting. But in the mid-19th century, the ideology of white supremacy that underpinned the institution of slavery, the claim that enslaved people were naturally inferior, naturally suited to servitude, incapable of the higher faculties of reason and self-governance, was not a fringe position. It was the ideological architecture of half a nation, and it was defended with a sophisticated and extensive apparatus of pseudoscience, religious argument, legal theory, and cultural production. Frederick Douglass demolished this architecture not by arguing against it in the abstract but by existing in undeniable and fully realized opposition to it. He was the argument. He had taught himself to read from chalk marks on fence boards and borrowed passages in street children's spelling contests and a textbook on oratory that he carried next to his skin. He had walked out of slavery and into one of the most distinguished public careers in American history. Every word he spoke and wrote was a fact that the ideology of white supremacy could not account for without either acknowledging its own falsehood or pretending that he, specifically, was some kind of exception. There were those who tried the second option, who acknowledged his particular gifts while using those very gifts as evidence that he was anomalous, that the standard measures of the ideology still apply to everyone else. He addressed this, too, with patient and devastating clarity. His legacy also lives in the specific human lives that his work touched and changed. And the people who came after. Martin Luther King Jr. used language that echoed Douglass. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew on arguments that Douglass had first articulated in the 1840s and 1850s. The constitutional strategy of the NAACP using the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to challenge segregation, ultimately successfully in Brown v. Board of Education, was a version of the constitutional abolitionism that Douglass had developed in argument with Garrison more than a century before. He is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York, the city where he lived and worked for the most productive decades of his life, the city where the North Star was born, the city where Anna Murray managed the household that was also a way station on the road to freedom. The grave is simple and well-maintained, shaded by trees in the quiet of a Rochester autumn. His house, Cedar Hill, in Anacostia, is a National Historic Site. You can visit it. You can walk through the rooms where he worked and read and received visitors in the last decades of his life. You can stand on the porch and look out at the view he looked at, the river, the city, the Capitol dome in the distance, and understand, in your body rather than just in your mind, what it meant for that view to be his. There is a statue of him in Rochester. There is one in Central Park in New York City. There are schools named for him and libraries and public squares. There is a portrait of him that hung for years in the halls of the United States Capitol, the most photographed person in the entire 19th century, as it turns out, because he believed in the power of the image and sat for photographs throughout his public life, refusing to smile in them, looking directly at the camera with an expression that communicated, calmly and without negotiation, exactly who he was. He knew what images meant. He knew what language meant. He knew what a story, told clearly and well, could do in the world. And the world was different for it. The life of Frederick Douglass is, among other things, a story about what happens when a mind that is told it does not exist refuses to accept the claim. It is a story about reading. About the specific, irreversible power of being able to read, the way that once language has entered you in that deep and private way, once the page has become a world you can inhabit and be inhabited by, no one can take that from you. Huald told his wife that teaching a slave to read would ruin him for servitude. He was absolutely right. Frederick Douglass, taught himself to read in the alleys and shipyards of Baltimore, and was ruined for servitude for the rest of his life. And the ruining of him was the making of him. And the making of him is still, in ways both visible and invisible, a part of the world we live in. Closing meditation. Let the story settle now. Let it settle the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, finding its level, becoming part of the ground beneath. We have traveled far tonight. We have walked the marshy ground of the eastern shore in the early morning light, and we have stood in the alleys of Baltimore with a young man holding chalk in the shape of letters in his mind. We have sat in a small room with forged papers and a borrowed uniform, in the dark before dawn, waiting for the courage to begin moving. We have felt the motion of a train through Maryland and Delaware, the long-held breath of the crossing, the moment when the landscape changed and the breathing could finally come a little easier. Let the Chesapeake Bay return, that long silver water at the edge of the low land, the herons standing still in the shallows, the light moving across the surface in the early morning the way light always moves across water, unhurried, unconcerned with anything but its own slow traveling. There is something in this story that belongs to you, wherever you are in the world, whatever life you are living. Not the specific history, not the specific geography or century or legal condition, but the thing underneath the history. The refusal to accept the diminishment of a human mind. The persistence of a self that the world keeps trying to deny. The way that a single act of courage, one person on one train on one September morning, can set something in motion that travels further than anyone watching that morning could possibly have predicted. You don't have to do anything with this now. You don't have to decide anything or act on anything. You are resting. You are breathing. The story has done its slow work of the night, and now you can let it go. Let your body release a little further into the weight of where you are. The shoulders. The jaw. The hands, open and soft in the dark. The North Star is still up there, behind whatever ceiling is above you, fixed and steady in the northern sky. It has been there every night of your life and every night of every life you have encountered in this story. It does not hurry. It does not argue. It simply holds its position in the sky and lets itself be found by those who need a fixed point in the darkness. You have a fixed point. You are in a safe place. You are warm and held and resting. Let the story carry you a little further into sleep. Let the images become the kind of images that drift at the edge of sleeping, the heron in the shallows, the silver surface of the bay, the loblolly pines standing still in the morning air, a train moving north through the flat September landscape, white sails on a long blue river, a man looking up at the stars. Rest now. You are exactly where you need to be. Rest. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.